So today we have two speakers who are very knowledgeable on the subject. Our first speaker is Jim Miller. He teaches English, Humanities, and Labor Studies at San Diego City College, and he's a political action community outreach vice president for the American Federation of Teachers. He's also the author of a number of books, and has lived in San Diego. Is he your whole life, right? San Diego? Almost, okay.
More or less.
All right. And so, because the teachers are very strong on this initiative, schools and communities first, we want to make sure that we have a good representative. So welcome Jim Miller, please.
Thanks so much for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank the League of Women Voters for being part of this campaign. There's a lot of other community partners, and hopefully together we can take on what's going to be a big challenge in November 2020. Just wanted to say a couple more things about kind of who I am and why I care about this. This is not just a kind of new campaign for me. I was part of something, I don't know if anybody heard of the March for California's Future. Many years back, I was one of the 6 core marchers who marched from Bakersfield to Sacramento, talking all along about the need for progressive tax reform to fund education and social services in California. It was a 48-day march, a real epic undertaking. And that march with CFT, some other labor partners and community partners, again, like California Calls and other folks, led to what first happened was a ballot measure called Majority Budget Act, which kind of helped end the gridlock constant every year, the budget being delayed in Sacramento. And then leading out of that momentum, I was part of the Millionaires Tax Campaign, which is the measure that was merged with Proposition 30, which raised taxes on the most affluent to fund education. And also deeply involved in Prop 55 because, most folks don't remember this, but both 30 and 55 are temporary measures, right? They expire, right? And I think the important thing about that history, and Andrea's going to talk more about the campaign, is before every single one of those initiatives, everybody said, "You're crazy, that will never happen." And they happened. So I'm here to tell you that even, though everybody says that this is an undertaking which perhaps is not going to end well, I have real experience in campaigns showing that, you can beat the big money, if you've got the right message and if you have a social justice message that talks about serving the future of the state. So really, from a personal standpoint, I've also got a son in high school who's going on to 4-year school. This is something that matters to me, both as an educator, and as a parent. So really what we're dealing with here is a movement that's afoot here in California with community organizations aligned with labor, promoting the schools and communities' first ballot measure. So you might ask, why would anybody want to touch the third rail of California politics? Well, the answer is simple. We can keep its central benefit to homeowners while closing an unnecessary corporate loophole which will help our schools, cities, and counties across California. So I could really just stop there. This whole thing is about closing an egregious corporate loophole. It doesn't affect individual homeowners at all, right? But the context is important, right? So in doing this, we're also going to be making our tax system fairer in California. And in base, this is a campaign that's about funding schools and community services, but it's also a campaign about fairness. So a little bit of background. Ever since its passage in 1978, Proposition 13 has starved California's schools and local governments of funding. And I can remember when I was, a kid in, K-12, that when this passed, we were all super psyched because nobody had to go to summer school anymore, right? That's my childhood memory of Proposition 13 is a rosy one, right? My perspective changed as I've grown up, right? So while the measure was pitched as a way to keep individual homeowners from being buried by taxes, the real beneficiaries of Prop 13 were not elderly folks and other vulnerable groups struggling to hang on to their homes, but super rich corporate property owners. What most voters don't know about Proposition 13 is that it gave huge commercial property owners like Disneyland the same tax break as your grandmother. And that's why, in a certain sense, it's kind of a scam, right? So, in fact, rather than liberating homeowners, Proposition 13 shifted the burden away from commercial property owners and onto individual households. As Robert Reich has noted, before the passage of Proposition 13, property taxes on houses accounted for 55% of property tax paid, while commercial property contributed 45%. Today, homeowners shoulder 72% of the tax burden versus only 28% for big commercial properties, right? So it's really kind of flipped it, in a pretty dramatic way. And even the benefits to individual homeowners are exaggerated. As Michael Hildzick has pointed out in the Los Angeles Times, most of the proposition's benefits went to wealthier Californians, 2/3 to homeowners earning more than $80,000 a year, and most to those earning $120,000 and up, right? So this was not equally, the benefits of Prop 13 were not equally distributed by any stretch of the imagination. Researchers from USC have documented that as a result of the post-Prop 13 property tax system, schools, cities, and counties have lost over $11 billion in revenue annually, with 80% of the losses coming from the largest 8% of commercial properties. Thus, this corporate tax loophole put a huge hole in California's finances that we've never recovered from. It's why we are 41st in the nation in per pupil spending and dead last in teacher to student ratio, for instance, and similar ratios apply to community colleges where I teach. It's why we spend more money on prisons than schools. And some of the research, since that time has shown that since Proposition 13 was passed in 1978, schools and communities have lost $585 billion, right? Imagine if that had not happened, just, your thought experiment for the day, right? How much better shape so much of our educational and community services could be. So thinking specifically about this, what would happen if this passed? $4.5 billion would go to education. Andrea is going to talk a little bit more about, the city services side. 89% of that would go to K-12, and 11% would go to community colleges for about $484 million, right? So that's a lot of new revenue, and there's a lot, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more, that we could do with that new revenue. Indeed, the biggest legacy of Proposition 13 has been that California, despite being the world's 5th largest economy, has schools, counties, and cities frequently struggling with austerity, particularly during economic downturns. Another way of putting it is that Proposition 13, the spawn of right-wing backlash politics, was very effective at what folks like Reagan administration David Stockman charmingly referred to as starving the beast. That is, preventing government from being effective by limiting resources and then calling for more cuts because of that very ineffectiveness, right? And that's really the kind of cycle that we're trying to work our way out of after decades, in California. In recent years, the good news is that Californians have shown more appetite for progressive taxes than for draconian cuts, as the passages of Propositions 30 and 55 with their temporary taxes on the rich to fund education showed. Now, with the Schools and Communities First measure, progressives are aiming to put Proposition 13 reform on the ballot in 2020 in an effort to finally address some of the glaring inequities that have resulted from that ill-conceived initiative. So what Schools and Communities First would do, again, as I mentioned in the beginning, is simply close the commercial property tax loophole by reassessing the top 13% of commercial properties valued at over $3 million at current rates. That's it. For instance, huge commercial properties that haven't changed hands for decades, like Disneyland again, are billed at 1970s rates, while newer homes and businesses in the same community pay a much higher rate. So you're a new, buyer, and, you're across the street from somebody who's been there decades. You have a radically, higher tax rate than your neighbor does. The measure would leave individual homeowners completely untouched and level the playing field for small and newer businesses that are not receiving the same protections as the richest commercial property owners. So one of the things that you're going to hear is, oh, how anti-business this is, right? Well, that's not particularly friendly to small business, the status quo that we have today in California. This simple, much-needed reform would bring in about $11 billion annually and help finally restore adequate funding for California's schools and local governments. It's already being fiercely opposed by the corporate sector that's happy to continue benefiting from this tax loophole despite the fact that it's both unfair and bad public policy. Right, why are they going to spend so much money trying to defeat this measure? Because they want to keep the money. It's better to spend all that money up front now and defeat it than have to give it up long term, right? And I think the early social media efforts funded by those very corporate interests call on voters to fight for Proposition 13 against an effort that they characterize as designed to destroy Proposition 13, and this is important, increase taxes on California homeowners and businesses. Of course, this is inaccurate because the measure leaves individual homeowners untouched and instead focuses on wealthy businesses and property valued at over $3 million. Why the lie? Perhaps because the merits of the actual reform are much tougher to dispute, hence the straw man argument with its appeal to fear. So what they're going to say over and over again is they're going to take away your Prop 13 tax benefits to individual homeowners, and it's simply not true. But if you spend enough money and repeat it over and over again, perhaps they think that this can work, right? So that's essentially what the battle is going to be. We might also hear the same kind of stale attacks at public sector employees, right? Because I'm responsible for all of the state's problems. And also a kind of hysterical calls that everybody is going to pick up their business and leave and go to Arizona, right? And we've heard these arguments before Prop 30, before Prop 55, and none of it happened, right? So it's simply not true. But it's a kind of stock and trade, of what's going to be the opposition to this measure. So I'll close just by saying, so why is this such a big deal? Well, what could this do for my college? Well, this means simply more classes for students, more full-time hires. Most people don't know this. I'm fortunate enough to have a full-time tenure-track job at San Diego City College. 70% of the classes on our campuses are taught by part-timers, who teach in 3, 4, 5 different colleges sometimes to make ends meet. You don't have the same stability in the faculty, right? This would allow that to happen, on our campuses. It would mean hiring more counselors. If you look at one of the things that helps students complete and go on to 4-year universities, it's having solid counseling in the beginning of their college careers rather than having, a kind of assembly line because you're too stretched to take care of, enough students. And also student services in a multitude of different ways, from mental health to counseling, because most people don't know this, but 10 to 20% of students at the place like City College where I teach and the community colleges across the state are housing insecure. Had a conversation in my labor studies, night class last night, where we're talking about kind of economic inequality in 3 or 4 of the students. And this is routine. Said, well, when I was homeless, right, that's who would benefit from this initiative, right? And the whole notion that maybe we could finally, for the first time in one of the richest states, in the richest country in the world, talk about one good way to solve problems for those students is things like wraparound services, right? Which in the current context always sounds like pie in the sky, right? But maybe we could finally get the money to do some of those things to help more people and raise a larger number of us up. At my son, who goes to San Diego High, just across the street from where I teach, for better or worse, and from his perspective, perhaps, what does this mean? Well, in K-12, this would bring $21,848 per classroom, $860 per student into the system. So think again, smaller class sizes, more counselors, nurses, teachers, again, wraparound services, all of those things that we need to raise students up, right? And that's, I think, what's centrally important about this. All of the revenue for this is going to be on top of the Prop 98 guarantee for revenue, and really importantly, this non-temporary measure is a game changer in California politics, right? For the first time, we're going to start talking about not putting the Band-Aid on temporarily and then hoping we're going to have a big economic boom that's going to take care of things, but actually reversing the damage that has done and working toward a more just state for people without the resources to pay their own way, right? So that's, I think, that's most, when you look at the poverty level in the state, when you look at the problems, that we're facing and the level of economic inequality, this kind of measure isn't just a tax reform measure. Fundamentally, it's a social justice measure and a social justice fight. So I hope you join us in that fight.
And I'd like to give a little personal thing. He was a student in 78. I was a young teacher in 1978, a high school teacher. And I was teaching biology. And all of a sudden, the labs that I used to get, I'd order all these different bacteria samples or cats to dissect or various things like that. Forget it. Forget it. That was all gravy. That was no longer available. So in fact, I created fantasy labs for my students so we could imagine if it was this, what would we do with that? So things changed overnight. So just a little personal point. All right, Andrea Guerrero is the executive director of Alliance San Diego. She leads an outstanding team that is building coalitions and mobilizing resources to achieve greater impact on the issues that matter. Before joining Alliance San Diego, Ms. Guerrero was the field and policy director of the ACLU of San Diego and Imperial Counties. Prior to that, she practiced immigration law before administrative, federal district, and appellate courts. She is a graduate of UC Berkeley Law School, University of Texas LBJ School of Public Affairs, and Stanford University. Originally from Mexico City, Ms. Guerrero views the world from a binational, bicultural, and bilingual lens. She has dedicated her professional life to protecting civil rights and advancing social justice. Please welcome Andrea.
Thank you. Good afternoon, buenas tardes. It's a real honor and a pleasure to be here with you today. I'm so grateful that I got this invitation because we are on the cusp of passing a legacy-shifting ballot measure. Make no mistake about it, the Schools and Communities First ballot measure will fundamentally change our future. Now, I came to California when I was a teenager, believing in a California dream. A dream where we can live in safety, we have neighborhoods with infrastructure that's functional and up to date, and the world of opportunity is open to us. The future is bright. That's the California that I arrived to when I was a young person. Now I'm a mother, and my child is going to school in the same school that Jim's child is going to school. In order to drive to school, I have to drive over lots of potholes. I have to worry about the quality of our water. I have to worry about the infrastructure that supports us, the neighborhood I live in, and I have to worry about the quality of the education that he gets. He has never had a library that's open to him all day long. He has always struggled to reach a counselor because the ratios of counselor to students are so high. In fact, yes, they are the highest in the country. And it shouldn't be so, right? That's not what I'm investing in my taxes here. That's not what you're investing in. whether you have children or grandchildren or you're just invested in the community, we all have the same dreams. We all want to live in a safe neighborhood, a livable neighborhood, and we want a California where everyone can get ahead, where everyone has the opportunity to reach their full potential, right? In order to achieve that dream, we need to invest in our future. We need to invest in world-class schools, first-rate infrastructure, and essential services that help us all get ahead. That's what this ballot measure will do. Now, Jim shared with you the nuts and bolts of what this would do around education. Just to remind you, that 40% of the revenue off of this ballot measure, which is estimated to generate $11 billion a year and growing over time, that 40% of that would go to education and 60% of that would go to cities and counties and special districts. Special districts include transit districts. And so it's the money that we could use to build more libraries, to fund parks, to create more hours for children and after-school youth programs, to fix our roads, to create more affordable housing. We could use this money to bond against. We could use this money to fill our gaps. There's no end to how we could use this money. Because we've been facing a shortfall of $11 billion a year, calculated to be over $585 billion over the last 40 years, cities and counties have had to try to fill the gap. And so every year, every election cycle, you see a revenue measure on the ballot. Maybe you see more than one, maybe you see several, maybe you see some from the state, some from the county, and some from the city. And you're seeing all of these. In fact, there are over 400 every election cycle, 400 revenue generating measures, because we're all trying to fill the gap left by Prop 13. So what does it mean for us to engage in this campaign? It means that we are standing up for tax fairness. We are seeking to restore tax fairness. 40 years ago, Prop 13 was passed, and it swung the pendulum in a dangerous and damaging direction, and the rhetoric became tax relief. Taxes are bad, government is bad, we don't want any more taxes, and we're okay with less government. Without considering the fact that good government helps us all get ahead. Good government helps us achieve our full potential, right? And so tax fairness is going to be the theme of the 2020 election. Yes, it is the 100-year anniversary of the League of Women Voters. It will be the 100th year anniversary of the vote for women. It will be all of these things, and it will be our opportunity to swing the pendulum back. After 40 years of disinvestment in the things that matter most to California, it's our opportunity to swing it back, right? And so here's our opportunity to have the very wealthiest among us who own commercial property or are wealthy land investors. It's our opportunity to have these folks pay their fair share. Their fair share. This is what this election will be about. Leading candidates like Elizabeth Warren, who are lifting up, tax fairness in the national landscape. We're going to be running alongside that, and that's important for us to know. Right now, at the national level, the idea of tax fairness is polling over 75%. Over 75% among all voters, right? That's a good landscape for us to be running in to talk about tax fairness. She's talking about taxing the itty-bitty super wealthy in this country. We're talking about restoring the tax rate through a reassessment on the property taxes for the largest property owners in the state of California, right? And it's an easy number to remember because we're trying to reform Prop 13, and the number of folks at the top that we're trying to get a tax assessment on, a reassessment on, is 13%, right? So we're going to tax the 13% in order to reform Prop 13. It's 13% of the commercial property landowners who have property valued over $3 million. Importantly, this ballot measure exempts out commercial property owners with land valued at $3 million or less. So that's 87% of the landowners in the state, right? As it turns out, it's really been this 13% at the top that's been benefiting year over year from the loophole that's resulted in the disinvestment in the very things that we need most to build a better future for California, right? And so I want to share a little bit with you about the campaign itself, where we're at, and where we're headed. So the campaign, as you heard from Jeannie, is in the middle of a refiling. We submitted a refiled ballot measure about 4 weeks ago, and we did that to take advantage of the time that we had to improve the initiative, strengthen our coalition, and address some additional loopholes that came to our attention. And so the measure is right now before the Attorney General and the Legislative Analyst's Office, and as soon as we get that back, we're going to start collecting signatures. We'll need to collect 1.5 million signatures. That's a lot of signatures, but we're confident we can do it because we qualified the last ballot measure, version 1.0, only a year ago, and we collected 1 million signatures. And we did that with your help. We did that with the help of other volunteers in the community and others who understood how important this measure was in order to restore tax fairness and reinvest in the California dream. This is a socially responsible ballot measure. We have over 400 endorsements, organizational endorsements across the state. We have been doing research on messaging. We have been very pleased to see that the tax fairness frame that we see at the national level resonating so well is resonating well in California. And we have good information to inform a message campaign strategy that we will be rolling out in the next 30 days that will coincide with the signature gathering portion of our campaign. We will begin gathering signatures probably in the first week of November. That's when we'll have the language back and we'll have the petitions printed and we'll get that out to all of you. And so I do encourage you to sign up to gather signatures because we're going to need everybody's help to do this. In terms of the viability of the campaign, I want to give you the confidence to know that although this is going to be perhaps the most important ballot measure fight of my lifetime, we are well funded. We are well funded, and we will continue to search for additional funding and additional support. We estimate that we're going to need to raise about $60 million for this campaign. We have about a third of that committed, and we're looking for the additional balance, and we're confident we're going to be able to get that. We know that this has been described as the Armageddon for the California Business Roundtable and the Howard Jarvis Tax Association, and they're estimating being able to raise about $100 million for this campaign. But we have won against these folks before. We've in fact won twice, and we did it against all odds. And it is absolutely because when we talk to voters about what is just and what is fair and what we need to invest in our future, the voters are with us. Even when we're outspent 2-1, the voters are with us. So this will be a big fight. We're going to need everyone in the fight, and it's going to make a big difference. I see a lot of questions being written down and fingers going up, so I want to leave a lot of room for questions about the initiative or about the campaign or the messaging, any of the above. Does that sound like a good idea, Jean?
Yes.
Okay. Yes. Thank you.
All right. One thing I wanted to point out also is that the confusion I had is that this is not for residential property at all. So if people live in it, doesn't matter. It's not just single-family homes, condos, apartment houses, If people live in it, it's residential. This is only for commercial, and it's for the commercial property that has, I think it's like 8% of the existing commercial property would fall into this. They are the ones that have been grandfathered under it. So we'll start with these questions. So I just answered the question, will owners of apartments pay more taxes? And if so, will that impact rents? So
Yeah.
do you wanna?
Yeah, just to reinforce what Jeannie said, no. Housing properties, whether they're 100% housing properties or mixed-use properties that have housing in them, rental units, condos, or individual homes, all of those will continue to be protected under Prop 13. This reform measure only reassesses commercial properties, and we can get into any particulars around mixed land use, but for the most part, it's just commercial property.
Thank you. All right, is it guaranteed that the money will go to where they say it will go?
Yes, there are strong accountability measures in schools and communities first. The funding will come down through the existing funding streams. So we have a funding stream for K through 12 schools and for community colleges. The funding will come down that same stream. We're not creating a new stream. The funding will come down to the cities, counties, and special districts in the existing stream. There are, in addition to identifying those streams, we are imposing strong accountability and transparency measures in there so we know exactly where it's going and the decision making is accountable.
All right, and here's a related question. If it's true, as economists say, that tariffs end up being passed on to consumers, why wouldn't a property tax increase not result in higher retail prices?
Yeah, so I think Jim addressed some of this, but it's about market competition. So we know, for example, that the handlery off of Interstate 8 pays about $160 per square foot in taxes. And we know that the Grand Hyatt pays 10 times that amount in property taxes, right? And why is that? Because the handlery is benefiting from this loophole and the Grand Hyatt isn't, right? Guess what? They charge similar rates. And so is one going to charge a higher rate? Is one going to pass on the cost? Well, they do so at their peril because then they risk losing their customers. And again, we know that when we pass Prop 55 and when we pass Prop 30 and we had these arguments about costs being passed or about folks leaving the state, it just didn't happen. The sky did not fall, and it's not likely to fall again.
And what were the changes made in the revised version of the initiative?
So we had a protection in there for small businesses whose commercial property was valued at $2 million or under. We lifted that to $3 million. That was a big shift. It didn't mean a lot in terms of the revenue generated, but it exempted out a lot more people. And so that's how we got to the 13% of commercial property owners who are now going to be taxed. So that was one big change. The other change was that we have basic aid school districts in the state. Those are school districts that are self-funded. They're in wealthy neighborhoods, and they don't rely on state funding. They were not going to get money from this initiative in the first version because of the way the funding stream works. Now they will. They will get a minimum amount of money, and we did that because we knew that the opposition was saying, well, not everybody's going to be able to get money. Like your neighborhood, your school, it won't get money because even though you're a wealthy school and maybe you don't need the money, we knew we were vulnerable to that. So we made sure that there was a minimum amount of funding going to those schools. And then we tightened up some of the zoning language to prevent people from identifying or from claiming they were a mixed-use development and then being able to get out of a reassessment. So those were the big changes. There were some minor technical things, but those are the big ones.
All right, and this is somewhat related. What happens if this new improved measure fails to make it on the ballot? Will less money be available from the first one?
Yeah, so we qualified the first version early, and we are benefiting from that early qualification to be able now to try to qualify a second. That first version is still projected to go to the November ballot. We can pull it back if we qualify the second measure. If we don't qualify the second measure for some reason, and I just don't see a scenario or a world where we don't do that because we were able to do it the first time, then we'll still benefit from the measure there, and it's still going to be $11 billion, and it's still a 40-60 split between schools and city services, county services, special districts, etc. But we will be vulnerable to the argument that we have a $2 million or less protection for businesses, for commercial property value, and then some money won't roll to all of the schools. So we'll be more vulnerable, and we'll be concerned about that. So we want to qualify the second measure.
Okay. What is the rate increase for properties valued at greater than $3 million? I think that would vary, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So all this measure would do is require a fair market assessment of commercial property, right? So I recently bought a home, and we bought the home from an elderly woman who was transitioning into her son's home. And she was paying much lower property taxes than I now pay, because at the point of sale, there was a reassessment. Now, as Jim mentioned, when corporations or large commercial property owners use the Prop 13 loophole, they don't age out of their home. They live forever, and they engage in scams like Michael Dell did when there was a property transfer and he avoided having to pay the new tax rate, get a new tax assessment by putting the property in the name of his wife in part and a dummy corporation in part. And so he split the percentage of the ownership, so nobody had more than 50% ownership, even though it was all him. And he didn't have to, there was no official transfer of property that would have triggered a reassessment. And so, before you start to think that, poor people who are going to be reassessed, we're talking about a 13% who is collectively making over $1 trillion a year right now. $1 trillion a year in revenue, right? Off of this property. And so we're not asking anything more or anything less of them than we ask of ourselves when there's a transfer of property. Because corporations are not people, we're asking that they pay a fair market rate and that they share their burden of the streets they use, the schools they send their kids to, and the city services that we all rely on.
And isn't it true that small businesses, when they sell, they have to be reassessed, right? And so it's just the big corporations that can play that game. Will this measure do anything for the requirement for a 2/3 vote for passing taxes that Prop 13 brought about? No, and again, it's not going to change anything for Prop 13 except for commercial properties that were, still have their assessment from the 70s. Isn't it also true that they won't get a big jump overnight? That when they get reassessed, it's going to be eased in a little?
Yeah, that's right. The measure provides for a phase-in. The legislature will consult with the assessors to define what the phase-in is, and the measure will also fund the phase-in. So the measure will fund the tax assessors to do this work.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've been hearing. We won't have enough tax assessors. They won't be able to do it. There's a lot of red herrings out there to get people to think about, the little issues that aren't going to happen. How would this ballot measure complement national efforts to create free public school tuition, the Green New Deal? How will consumers and rental population be protected from cost shifting by property owners and their end users? Have we already answered some of that?
Well, maybe you want to take some of this. But this is about restoring tax fairness. Plain and simple. This is not the answer to all social justice questions. But it is, if we are able to do this, friends, if we are able to reform Prop 13 to close this loophole, we will start to swing the pendulum back the other way that has been disinvesting, led to the disinvestment in California over the last 40 years, right? This won't answer all of our questions, but the issue of tax fairness is one that has plagued our nation for 40 years. It began here. We need to stop it here. Send that pendulum the other way.
Yeah. And I agree with what Andrea said about, it's unrelated essentially technically to all those other things, but it's part of a larger movement to push back. I'll put my labor studies hat on here too, is, we're living in an oligarchy. We're living in a country that's more dominated by corporate interests and big money than almost at any time in its history. So this is a seminal kind of social justice measure in the sense that it actually begins to push back against that. And I think that, in that big picture way that kind of that question sort of comes from is this is the kind of thing that happens at the state level that helps open up horizons in other states and on the national level. When you start talking about kind of what economic justice would really mean in an era of historic economic inequality, right? So it doesn't do all those things all at once, but it's a very important first foray, and it would be a huge win if you care about restoring some degree of economic fairness and justice in the country.
Well, this sort of comes from, kind of related, how do we reframe the fear-based paranoid narrative stating, I'm just reading it, this is just the Democrats' first step. Next, they'll come for your residential property tax.
Yeah, so we just completed some message testing, and the benefit of qualifying early is that the opposition, we drew the opposition out. And the opposition has been spending an enormous amount of money, like $100,000 every week, in order to pump social media ads to you and get you to believe all of the things that they're saying, right? So we had the benefit of them putting their best arguments out there. And we took those and we tested them. And I am thrilled to share with you that the message testing that we just got back tells us that our messages of tax fairness, our messages of future investment, our messages of shifting the burden back to where it should be is working. Now, we haven't done our education campaign right now. I live by the mantra, rest in reason, move in passion. We've been doing a lot of resting in reason because we don't want to start spending money until we know exactly what we're going to say. And then we want to spend and we want to drive a message home that builds the narrative for a winning campaign, right? We're out here to win, and they're doing their very best. We can see that our messages are resilient to their messages. We just have to get our message out, and that's what we're going to be doing starting in November to coincide with the signature gathering campaign.
And I'll add a little bit of, what I often see is that the gun lobby uses that sort of thing too, but it's like saying, well, yeah, they made a speed limit of 65. Next, they're going to make it 55, and before you know it, you'll be having to go 30 on the freeway. We want to use reason. What is reasonable, and having them pay such low taxes when other companies that are competing against them are paying much higher taxes is not reasonable, and it really isn't capitalistic.
And
I'd actually add to that, like when we did focus groups before the millionaire's tax, which eventually got fused with the governor's measure in Prop 30, was really amazing, and even when I was on that march, literally I spent every day waking up, standing on the back of a flatbed truck at some elementary school in like Tulare or something, and talking to people. But what we found, both in the polling and then what I found talking to people in the Central Valley, which is the most conservative part of the state politically, is that large numbers of even Republicans get how radically redistributed wealth has been over the last 30 years in this country, and they don't like it. Right? So I think that keeping it simple, is the way to win, which is like, it's not about all the rest of that stuff. These guys have a giant tax loophole that they've been taking advantage of. Time for them to pay their fair share so your kid's school can get more money. It's a pretty simple argument, and it's a winning argument. And I think that sometimes, particularly in California, at least in my experience over several of these different campaigns, is because of the success of that kind of right-wing backlash politics for 30 years and what we're going through right now in this country, a lot of times people are so afraid just to forthrightly say things. But I think, what Andrea is saying is that some of the programs that, that Warren is suggesting, even some of the things that Sanders is suggesting are actually very popular, right? And I think that the campaign we just need to have the courage to tell the truth about, what's happened with wealth in this country. And, we're not talking about some kind of revolution. We're talking about closing a simple tax loophole.
Yeah.
That's a very reasonable argument, but we need to take advantage and properly direct the populist anger in the country. Properly direct it, not, blame people who have nothing to do with the inequities that people are suffering.
Yeah.
Yeah, our pathway is clear, friends. Our pathway is crystal clear. Our polling tells us, national polling tells us, if we talk about tax fairness and we talk about the future and why it matters, we will win. We can't get distracted by what the opposition is going to use. We know that if we stay on message, that our messages are resilient to their opposition. We know that, right? We also know that the national landscape is going to be very helpful. We're going to be able to ride a wave of a national conversation talking about fairness and justice. We know that in national polling, when you ask people, what do you care more about? Everyone paying their fair share or paying less in taxes? Overwhelmingly across every political group, people are more concerned about everyone paying their fair share.
And,
Right.
and one other note, just a practical note, look at the teacher strike wave across this country. In Los Angeles, you had overwhelming public support, and they were talking about this initiative the entire time.
Right.
And it was extremely popular. And for gosh sake, we were winning in Oklahoma, in West Virginia, in Arizona, on messages about like we need to adequately fund our schools, right? So I think the kind of basic bread and butter message framed in fairness is, I think, a very winning message, and I think that this is, in a certain sense, as Andrea is saying, there's a real window here that's kind of historically unique that we're kind of stepping into.
All right. Are there any business groups, small business, for example, who support this effort?
Absolutely, there are small and big businesses who support this, and I would say that many of them are in Silicon Valley, and we're only getting started here in San Diego. And why do they care? Because they're facing unfair competition, right? You have an Adobe next to Facebook, and they're paying significantly different tax rates, right? And so they get it from a social justice point of view. They also get it from a business competition point of view. Our current tax structure, our current loophole system that benefits legacy corporations is not good for new business. It's absolutely not good for new business, right? So we do have a significant amount of support. We are in the process of putting up a new website for the campaign, but you can go to the existing website of Schools and Communities First, and you'll be able to see, lots and lots of endorsers. But we'll have a refresh on that within the next 30 days. I can tell you that we, probably a quarter of our money is going to come from the business sector.
Okay. California public school spending, this is from the LA Times, reports that this is a record high, May 12, 2019, up from just $65 billion in 2014. With state spending up 50% in just 5 to 6 years, why do schools need more money?
Start, I can finish. Sure. No, well, I think a couple things to keep in mind is that we also, everybody has points to the amount of money spent on schools, but we're also larger than most countries in the world in California, so it's a little bit of a funky way to cite those numbers. And in fact, much of that has to do with the fact that the passage of Prop 30 and then the passage of Prop 55 helped dig us out of the hole that we were in after the Great Recession, right? You know, so I think that the thing that people need to keep in mind, even with that momentary bit of better news on education spending, that Prop 55 is going to expire. So what we need to do is think long-term and structurally. Do you want to just hope that that expires in a year with a good economy and, you know, we're going to have more money in the system? Or do you want to make a structural reform to the tax system in California to permanently fix the problem?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'll add that property tax is the most stable kind of tax that we have, right? And so when our school system is based on a millionaire tax, which is income-based, which is dependent on the economy, that's a very volatile source of income, right? And that's what we're relying on right now. So the best we can do is to increase the property tax base that helps fund our school system, and that will help stabilize the funding. And we, you know, as Jim mentioned, we're 41st in per pupil spending in the country. That's not a good place to be. We're dead last in the ratio of students to counselors and students to nurses, right? That's a bad place to be. That's not the school system that I went to school in, but that's the school system that my son is in, right? And I don't want my grandson or my granddaughter to be in even worse shape. It's not gonna get better, friends. And in fact, in a few years, we're probably gonna be facing a recession, and we're gonna see a downturn in the unstable, the more volatile resources that are currently funding our school system.
All right, and will this proposition help lower the cost of attending college in California?
It will certainly help from having to have increases in community colleges, but the revenue doesn't go to four-year schools, correct?
Correct.
So that's another problem to fix.
Yeah, but what it does do is it, you know, frees up other resources, right? So when we're not scrambling to try to meet the basic funding needs of K through 12, then we have more resources to fund into other things, higher education, etc.
All right, well, we don't have any other questions. So for those of you, if you feel that this is something worth your while, again, there are sign-up sheets on your tables. Be sure to sign up, and we will notify you through the email that when the petitions are ready. You might want to sign up like one petition and just get your family and friends to sign, or you may want to help us with some of these signature gathering drives. So I hope you will sign up and join us, and thank you. I'll thank our speakers.